In this question, a scientist conducts 2 experiments using the same reaction and same conditions, except experiment 2 is carried out at a higher temperature than experiment 1. And we can see this in the graphs provided, which show the distribution of energies for reactant particles in each experiment, with the activation energy for the reaction EA labeled. So let's have a look at our graphs. So for each of these graphs, we have proportion of particles on the y-axis and kinetic energy on the x-axis. And we're told that experiment 2 has a higher temperature than experiment 1. So if you look at our green line on the graph, in experiment 1, we can see the peak of our line versus in experiment 2. It's farther to the left in experiment 1. And since kinetic energy is on our x-axis, that means we have a lower kinetic energy at the peak for experiment 1. And for experiment 2, since the peak is further to the right than it is for experiment 1, and again, the x-axis is kinetic energy, that means that the peak has higher kinetic energy in experiment 2. So that's kind of like our average kinetic energy. It's higher in experiment 2 than it is in experiment 1. And temperature is a measure of the average kinetic energy of the particles. So that part makes sense. The other thing shown on our graph is the activation energy labeled EA. So we can see that on our graphs here. That's that vertical dotted blue line. And we can see it's in the same place for both experiment 1 and experiment 2 on the x-axis. And that makes sense since these are the same reaction carried out under the same conditions. The only difference is the temperature. We don't have a catalyst here. So in this particular experiment, the activation energy is the same for both experiment 1 and experiment 2. Okay, so our goal is going to be figuring out in which experiment is the rate of reaction greater. So first we're going to think about the average kinetic energy of the reactant particles. In which experiment is that greater? Now we know, based on the definition of temperature, that a higher temperature means a higher average kinetic energy. So we already know that experiment 2 is going to be the one with the higher temperature and the higher kinetic energy. But also looking at our graph, as we mentioned, the peak is further to the right. So we can see that experiment 2 has a higher average kinetic energy than experiment 1, just because that peak is shifted to the right to the higher kinetic energies. So the answer to the first question here is going to be experiment 2. The next question asks, in which experiment is the activation energy required for the reaction to take place greater? So we're looking at activation energy here. As we've already discussed, we don't have a catalyst in either experiment 1 or experiment 2. And that's the only thing that's going to affect our activation energy since we've got the same reaction happening. So they actually both have the same activation energy, which we can see by the fact that they're both at that kind of second square on the graphs for both of them. So the activation energy is going to be equal for experiment 1 and experiment 2. Lastly, it's asking us, in which experiment do a higher proportion of particles have enough kinetic energy to meet or exceed the activation energy? So we're going to go ahead and kind of color in on our graph the proportion of particles that meet or exceed the activation energy. So here's our activation energy. So any particles that have a kinetic energy equal to or greater than that, those are the ones that are going to react. So that's anything in here. So that's our proportion of particles in experiment 1 that meet or exceed the activation energy. In experiment 2, again, here's our activation energy in the same place. So we can go ahead and shade in anything to the right-hand side of that line. So we can see that in experiment 2, where we had the higher temperature and therefore the higher average kinetic energy, a much higher proportion of particles have enough kinetic energy to meet or exceed that activation energy. That's why we have a much bigger area shaded in experiment 2. So our answer to this question here is going to be in experiment 2, there's a high proportion of particles that meet or exceed the activation energy. So lastly, in which experiment is the rate of reaction greater? Well, we know rate of reaction is based on the number of successful collisions, and when we have more particles reaching the kinetic energy required to meet the activation energy, that's going to increase the success rate of our collisions. So in which experiment is the rate of reaction greater? Experiment 2.